May 17, 1943. The cold Atlantic waves slapped against the hull of the German U-boat U-515, its periscope scanning the expanse of gray choppy sea. Captain Werner Schulze stood at the helm, eyes squinting against the rising mist. His hands gripped the cold metal, a steady, firm presence, as the U-boat lurked just below the surface. The faint hum of the engines echoed in the ship, the sound of a predator stalking its prey. Anything. Schulze's voice was sharp, his gaze locked on the horizon. Oberleutnant Dietrich Müller, the U-boat's radar operator, scanned the radar screen with a practiced eye. "Yes, Captain. We've got a large ship bearing 270 degrees. Approaching at speed." Schulze's heart quickened. "Identify it." Müller adjusted the settings on the radar, his face tensing as the contact grew closer. "It's an American warship, sir. USS Greer, a Fletcher-class destroyer." Schulze's gaze hardened. The Fletcher-class was one of the most advanced American destroyers, equipped with powerful guns, torpedoes, and radar. To capture such a vessel, especially in the heart of the Atlantic, would be a remarkable feat, one that could turn the tide in the German favor, if only for a moment. "Prepare to surface. Full speed ahead." Schulze ordered, his tone cold with resolve. "We can't let her escape." The U-boat surfaced, its periscope retracting as the crew scrambled into action. The bridge erupted with the sound of orders being barked and crew members rushing into position. Schulze's mind raced. The Greer was heading straight into their path, seemingly unaware of the looming threat. The moment of opportunity had arrived, and Schulze wasn't about to waste it. The U-515, with all its might, lurched forward, rising through the water as the ship prepared to launch its deadly torpedoes. Here the torpedoes. Schulze ordered, his gaze never leaving the enemy ship. Moments later, 3 torpedoes sped through the cold Atlantic, cutting through the water towards the Greer. The sharp, deafening hiss of the weapons leaving their launch tubes echoed through the U-boat. The result was immediate. A violent explosion rocked the sea, the torpedoes slamming into the hull of the American ship. The U-515 crew held their breath, waiting for the expected result. The Greer would go down. But to their surprise, the ship held firm, only shuddering with the force of the blast, and continued its assault. "Direct hit." Müller shouted, but his voice was tinged with confusion. "She's still afloat, Captain." Schulze's face tightened. "Impossible," he muttered. The American destroyer, though badly damaged, did not surrender. It returned fire with a fury, unleashing depth charges that detonated around the U-boat, sending shockwaves that reverberated through its hull. The crew scrambled to stabilize their position, and the alarms blaring as water filled the compartments below. Despite the damage, the U-515 managed to evade further destruction, diving deeper into the Atlantic's cold depths. But the Greer wasn't finished. The American warship continued to retaliate, its guns firing in defiance. Schulze cursed under his breath. The initial hit had not been enough. They had underestimated the resolve of the American ship. "Surface again, we need to finish this," Schulze barked. The U-boat slowly emerged from the depths, moving toward its prey with calculated precision. This time, however, Schulze ordered the crew to secure the ship intact. Capturing the Greer was no longer a choice. It was a necessity. The Americans had no choice but to surrender. After hours of tense maneuvering and exchanges of fire, the American crew finally relented, forced to abandon their ship. They were captured by the U-515's crew and taken aboard the U-boat, where they were held under guard. The U-515's officers boarded the Greer, the captured warship now under German control. What awaited them on board would change their understanding of the war, the enemy, and the path to victory. As the German officers stepped aboard the USS Greer, they were immediately struck by the difference between this American warship and the older, more worn-down vessels they had encountered in the Mediterranean and North African theaters. The Greer wasn't just another ship. It was a symbol of American naval power and technological sophistication. "We've been told about American advancements, but this," muttered Lieutenant Kurt Fisher, an engineering officer aboard the U-515. His voice trailed off as his eyes took in the imposing machinery, the advanced weapon systems, and the seamless efficiency of the ship's operations. The crew moved through the lower decks, eyes wide with astonishment. Every piece of equipment, from the boilers to the radar systems, was meticulously designed, modern and efficient. Fisher walked past the ship's engine room, his boots clicking against the polished metal floor. He bent down to examine the massive turbines, running his hand over the metal with a mix of reverence and disbelief. "The turbines are incredible," Fisher remarked to his fellow officer, Oberleutnant Müller, who was examining the radar systems. "The efficiency of this engine, it's almost too much. It runs at a speed and power we didn't think was possible for a ship of this size." Müller nodded, his expression a mixture of awe and concern. "Look at the radar. This is far superior to what we've got on our U-boats. It can detect submarines at much greater ranges than anything we've been able to deploy." As the officers continued their tour, they noted the ship's advanced armament, multiple rapid-fire 5-inch guns, and sophisticated anti-aircraft batteries. The Germans had thought that the American Navy was still behind in terms of weaponry. But what they were seeing told a very different story. The ship's arsenal could easily outgun any of their own vessels in the Atlantic. But it wasn't just the weaponry or machinery that left the German officers uneasy. It was the overall design and construction of the ship. The Americans had managed to create a warship that was not only formidable in combat, but also impressively efficient to maintain. The Greer could be repaired and refueled quickly, and the high standards of its production meant that the ship could endure damage and keep fighting. "We've always thought of America as a country that could only send men to fight," Fisher muttered, staring at the ship's advanced design. "But this is a country that can build entire fleets, whole armies, faster than we can destroy them." Schulze, who had been silently observing the officers' reactions, finally spoke up, his voice grave. "This ship is only one. How many more like it do they have? How many ships are they building right now, if they can build them this fast and this well? We are fighting a war we can't win." His words lingered in the air as the reality of the situation began to settle on the German officers. The Greer was not an isolated example. It was just one of many ships the United States was churning out in massive quantities. And each ship was as advanced, if not more so, than the last. Germany had always relied on its ability to wage war with precision and cunning, striking quickly and decisively. But the scale of American industrial production was something they hadn't anticipated. Fisher, his hands still running along the edges of a gun mount, finally looked up and said, "If they can replace every ship we sink, if they can keep producing these machines, what chance do we have?" Schulze didn't answer immediately, his gaze lingering on the ship's radar. "None," he muttered, his voice hollow with the weight of the realization. The German officers moved silently through the ship, now fully aware that this was not just a war of tactics, it was a war of resources. America's ability to produce military technology and maintain its forces in the face of constant conflict had been underestimated. The capture of the Greer wasn't just a tactical victory. It was the moment they understood that the Allies had the industrial power to outlast them, to keep replacing losses indefinitely. The Germans were not just facing an army, a navy, or an air force. They were facing an entire war machine built for long-term sustainability. "So this is the moment we've been dreading," Schulze said finally. "This ship is proof of what America can do. And they will keep building more." As the hours passed aboard the USS Greer, the realization struck the German officers like a cold, unforgiving wave. What they had initially thought was a temporary advantage, the capture of an American warship, had rapidly shifted into something far more significant. The Greer was not just a single ship in their fleet, it was the tip of the iceberg. This was not a momentary glimpse of American technology. It was the first time they fully understood the scale of America's war effort and industrial capabilities. Captain Schulze stood silently on the bridge, his eyes scanning the horizon. The wind whipped through the open hatch, carrying with it the salt of the sea. His mind, however, was far from the calm ocean before him. He was trapped in thought processing everything the officers had seen on board. "Captain," Fisher said quietly as he approached, "we need to report this to Berlin." Schulze nodded, but remained silent for a moment. The officers had been instructed to report their findings about the ship's specifications and weaponry. But now, there was more to consider. This was no longer a simple mission to capture a ship. This was about understanding the true scale of the American war machine. "We will." Schulze finally replied, his voice heavy with realization. "But I fear they won't fully grasp what we've seen. They think the war can be won by traditional means, by striking hard fast and overwhelming the enemy. They don't see it, Fisher. This war isn't just about who fights harder. It's about who can outlast the other. And the Americans, they have endless resources to keep going." Fisher stood there for a moment, considering Schulze's words. His thoughts raced back to the ship's engine room, where the American machinery had stood out as almost otherworldly. The efficiency, the design, everything about it was built to produce more faster. Unlike Germany's factories, which were now struggling with limited resources and air raids, the American factories were operating at full capacity with no sign of slowing down. "How many ships like this are there, Captain?" Fisher asked quietly. "How many more are they building as we speak?" Schulze didn't have an answer. He could only guess, and that uncertainty weighed heavily on him. His mind raced back to the previous year, when they had believed the United States would be bogged down by its own logistical challenges, stretched too thin by the demands of war on two fronts. But now standing on the deck of the Greer, Schulze knew that assumption was a fatal mistake. The Americans weren't struggling. They were thriving. The German officers turned their attention to the strategic implications of what they had discovered. The Greer was just one of many ships the United States was producing in massive quantities, and its advanced technology was proof that America was not only capable of building these ships, but also at a rate far surpassing Germany's production capacity. They had believed that if they could destroy American supply lines and choke off resources, the United States would eventually crumble. But now they realized that the sheer volume of ships, tanks, and aircraft being produced was something no strategic blow could easily incapacitate. As Schulze stood on the deck of the captured destroyer, his mind went over the key points of his observations and the ship's incredible speed, its powerful radar, and its durable construction. The fact that such a vessel could be built so quickly was even more troubling than the ship's capabilities themselves. The Germans had managed to outproduce their enemies in the early stages of the war. But America had gone beyond the simple output of weapons. It had transformed into an industrial juggernaut that could not be stopped. Fisher, standing nearby, couldn't help but voice the thought that was lingering in his mind. "They're outproducing us, Captain. No matter how many U-boats we sink, no matter how many ships we destroy, they'll keep coming. Every day more ships, more planes, more tanks." Schulze turned his gaze to the horizon. "Yes, and that's what we've overlooked. We thought the war would be decided by battles by the strength of our forces. But the Americans don't fight with just strength. They fight with resources, and they can replace whatever they lose. Fisher's face darkened. Then it's over, isn't it? Schulze didn't respond immediately. The truth was heavy, suffocating. His silence spoke volumes. The battle for survival was no longer just a matter of tactics and skill. It was about endurance. And with the United States' ability to produce war machines at an astonishing rate, the odds were shifting. The crew aboard the U-515 had been proud of their early successes, sinking ships and inflicting damage to the Allied supply lines. But now Schulze understood that this would only go so far. The balance of the war was tipping, and Germany, despite all its military brilliance, could not keep up with the industrial might of the United States. "We need to report to Berlin," Schulze said finally. "But we need to prepare ourselves for what's coming. The tide is turning, and we've been blind to it." As the U-515 made its way back into the open sea, the officers couldn't help but reflect on the significance of what they had discovered. The capture of the USS Greer had been a victory, yes, but it had also been a moment of brutal clarity. The Germans had underestimated America's industrial power, and now they knew that no matter how many battles they won, and they were facing an opponent that could sustain itself indefinitely. The war had just become something far bigger and far more terrifying than they had ever imagined. As the U-515 cruised back into the deep waters of the Atlantic, its crew remained silent and the gravity of what they had just witnessed hanging heavy over them. The USS Greer, now captured and in their possession, was a stark reminder of the unimaginable scale of American production. It wasn't just the ship itself, it was the realization that for everyone they sank, another would rise in its place. That was the true power of the United States, the relentless cycle of creation and destruction. The journey back to port was long, and in the days that followed, Schulze and his officers would meet to discuss what had transpired. The war at sea had always been a battle of tactics, of cat-and-mouse games in the dark depths of the ocean. But now they realized the rules had changed. It was no longer just a war of maneuver, it was a war of attrition, and in that arena, the Germans were outmatched. In a meeting below deck, Schulze gathered his senior officers around the table. "We have to acknowledge the truth." Schulze began, his voice quiet but firm. "What we've seen aboard the Greer is just a glimpse of the true scale of American industrial power. This is not just a battle for control of the seas. The Americans have transformed their economy into a war machine capable of replacing every ship, every plane, and every tank we destroy. We cannot outproduce them. We cannot outlast them." Fisher, still reeling from the discovery, looked up sharply. "So, what now? We've been told that victory is a matter of pushing hard and breaking their resolve. But if they can replace their losses faster than we can inflict them, what do we have left?" There was no answer at first. The officers exchanged glances, each one silently grappling with the same sobering realization. The German military had always prided itself on precision, on strategy, on outsmarting its opponents. But the United States, with its unyielding industrial base, had tipped the balance. America wasn't just fighting the war, they were fueling it, and they could keep fueling it indefinitely. "We've relied on our ability to hit hard and fast." Schulze said, his voice heavy with the weight of the truth. "But the longer this war goes on, the more we will realize that it's not about individual battles. It's about resources, about how much we can sustain, and whether we can outlast the Americans. The answer, I fear, is no." Mueller, the radar operator, spoke up, his voice tight with frustration. "So what do? We keep sinking ships, attacking convoys. But all the while, the Americans build more faster than we ever could. We do our duty. Schulze said, though his tone was quieter now, tinged with resignation. We fight as best we can, but we have to understand that the future is not in our hands. The Americans will win this war not by military brilliance, but by sheer industrial might, and there is nothing we can do to stop it. As the meeting ended, the officers filed out, each lost in their own thoughts. Schulze lingered, staring out at the horizon from the bridge. The cold wind whipped through the open hatch, but he barely noticed. His mind was consumed with the truth he had learned: the war was no longer about battles or tactics. It was about an industrial revolution that Germany couldn't compete with. Back in Germany, High Command would soon receive the report of the captured Greer. But even they would struggle to understand the implications. The officers had seen the reality, but how could they explain the depth of the situation to a country that still clung to the belief in victory through superior strategy alone? Meanwhile, in the United States, the American war machine continued to grind forward its factories, churning out more ships, more planes, more weapons than ever before. The tide of war was shifting, but the Germans hadn't yet realized that the real battle was no longer for control of Europe or the Pacific. It was a battle for endurance, and the Americans were in it for the long haul. The capture of the USS Greer had been a moment of brief triumph, but it had also been the moment when German officers finally understood the insurmountable challenge they faced. The industrial power of the United States, once thought to be a secondary concern, had now revealed itself to be the true heart of the Allied effort. And it was a power that no military strategy could overcome. The war as they knew it was no longer a contest of tactics. It had become a contest of who could last the longest, and in that fight, Germany was doomed to lose.